Good morning. For those of you who are in here, we have 2 minutes until we start. Just wanted to open it up for people to start filing in. We'll get going here in 2 minutes.
Michael, do we need to click the record button?
It's recording. It's auto record.
Nice.
All right, guys, we'll give it just a few more minutes here, or I'm sorry, a few more seconds. We've got about 20 seconds and we'll get up and running here for the webinar. Can you see the presentation?
I do.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's 11 a.m., so we'll go ahead and get started. At any time here, hello, I can definitely see everything. Okay, thank you, Pam. At any time here, if you guys have questions, please feel free to shoot them into the chat or the Q&A here of the webinar platform. We'll be happy to stop along the way and answer them for you. I'm Michael Clark with BAM Weather. Alongside with me is Kirk Hens and Brett Waltz, and they will be presenting the summer and growing season forecast here for everybody. And I'll kind of just be moderating and chatting with them as we go. We're going to talk about the summer forecast and winter verifications from our last outlook. We're going to talk about the ENSO evolution, kind of, we're coming into a third year La Niña, the rarity of that. We're going to talk about the drought. We'll look at what summers normally look like, this recent climatology, and then we'll go over our analog years and our official outlooks. So these guys have put in a ton of time and research and effort into this presentation to make sure we can, present you the best possible forecast that we have. So we'll start it with the verification of the summer forecast last year. Overall, it was a very good forecast. Really from start to finish, it was good in, temperatures and precipitation. I mean, from what we put out on the left to what verified on the right, everybody really did a fantastic job with the forecast, the outlook, and the risks, and really everything. Really, the outlook last year, if you were getting our information prior to summer, you really had the upper hand because we had really good data and really good verifications there versus what we put out. And really, as challenging as winter was, it wasn't too bad. The exception with the east and the southeast, the general orientation wasn't bad. The precip outlook was really, really good. But the winter is just always so challenging to nail down. But at the end of the day, looking back, it wasn't bad. Just like I said, just the East Coast there, the Southeast was warmer than what we had anticipated. But overall, the last two big seasons, these guys have done a fantastic job at predicting these. So, we show these verifications to show you that, we can do this. It's not impossible as some may think. So without further ado, Brett, let's talk about the persisting La Nina conditions and kind of this is really driving the entire summer outlook. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'd say that this is really the biggest global pattern driver right now. And a lot of times we get into the spring season and we see the La Nina that was from the fall or the previous winter, and it tends to break down, it tends to weaken. And really, if anything, it's kind of been the opposite as we've worked into the spring. La Nina has held on very, very strong. And in some cases, I think it was from March to April, it actually strengthened a little bit. So this has really been dominating the global pattern. You can see the sea surface temperatures there in the upper right, really a basin-wide La Nina. And the forecast in the bottom right there, going forward, you can see trying to continue at least a weak La Nina into the summer months.
Yeah, sorry, Brett, I was muted there. But yeah, I mean, it's, it's interesting because, we're going into this summer, it's being that it's a really a third year La Nina. I mean, tell us about, I mean, is this something that happens normally? Where can we look for answers for this? What's going on with this?
Yeah, this is the first time since 2000. So it's been more than 20 years since we've seen 3 consecutive summer seasons that have had a third year La Nina. And if you go all the way back to really when records started in 1950, it's only the 4th time it's happened. And I would even argue that a couple of those years in there are a little bit loose. We are really struggling to find years that had a similar progression going into a third straight year of a La Nina. It just doesn't happen very often. 70, 75 years of good history. And this is only the 4th or 5th time that it's really ever happened. Now, the years that it did happen, it tended to favor heat in the western and southwestern plains, which just happens to be where the worst drought conditions are right now. So certainly some similarities we've already seen with a couple of these years, but I'll note that confidence in analogs beyond really the year 2000 is just lower than normal because the climate as a whole is different and the data is not always as reliable that far out from an analog perspective, just because of how the pattern has changed as we've gone through time and warmed up the globe generally.
Kirk, I'm curious too. I know this has wreaked havoc on the pattern in South America. Tell us a little bit about what this La Nina is doing to South America growing season right now.
Yeah, it's a huge deal because typically, like what Brett said, is we go into spring or their fall down there in the southern hemisphere. La Nina, it really warms up significantly and it goes away. In fact, all the years pretty much that we looked at in the past that are similar throughout the wintertime had warmed. So in fact, we did the direct opposite this year. We went into a strong La Nina over the last couple of months, and it is just essentially completely shut off the tap of precipitation for central Brazil, that very important second crop safrinha corn crop in there has just gotten absolutely no precipitation whatsoever. So it is a clear and direct influence to precipitation or the lack thereof that's going on down there. So it is a huge deal. Very rare.
Yeah, and globally too. Really, it's a global impact for sure. So, Kirk, tell us, as we kind of continue that discussion with the evolution of La Nina. Tell us what do these evolution analogs mean? Tell us a little bit about how these are computed and compiled, if you will.
Yeah. So just like the word evolution means is just like, hey, what is our idea of what we think ENSO or El Nino Southern Oscillation, El Nino or La Nina, how do we think that evolves? And we look at the past and see, in similar years, yes, we've only had 3 or so 3-year La Ninas, but in terms of just La Nina and generally, how have those years evolved as we go from spring into summer? And we try to look at the past to just get glimpses. It's not going to be perfect. There's no one year that is the same as previous years, but just glimpses of what those years did as we go into our next month here. And so if you look on the top left, the temperatures here, those ENSO analogs all the way from last year was a La Nina to, 1956. Just as Brett had alluded to as well, significant heat in the central United States. We have already seen multiple patterns here over the last 1 to 2 months of heat being focused in that area specifically. And where that heat goes, oftentimes that dryness goes. As you can see the map that is just below it as well. A lot of that red is over areas with significant drought right now, from Texas, Oklahoma, I would say eastern Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska here. And we're going back into that pattern as well with very dry conditions. So a lot of times, although not perfect, the past can tell us some glimpses of what's ahead of us. And it's also ironic that it is already matching up to the areas where we're already getting warm and already very dry. So it's just a good way to look back at how things have evolved and give us some glimpses of going forward.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome.
and Kirk, I would note along with that, not only the third year Niña kind of persisting into the summer months, but also just the past weekly ENSO reading, ENSO 3.4, one of the coldest on record for this time of year. So not only do we need to look at third year La Niñas, we need to look at years that persisted with La Niña, but we also need to start looking at some of the years that had the coldest La Niña or the strongest La Niña on record into the summer months. And that's kind of what we're looking at here. Just if we end up staying as one of the colder or stronger La Niña states into the summer months, that would pose the risk that maybe the heat can expand a little bit more into the eastern ag belt regions. Still tends to favor it a little bit further south, southeastern plains, and into parts of the Mississippi Valley. But that would then end up posing the risk that parts of the eastern ag belt into Indiana, Iowa, Illinois, and into the deep south could end up being a little warmer as well.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, it really intrigues me for summertime MCS stuff. I think you kind of see these patterns. You look at strong thunderstorm clusters. So we can get more into that. Now let's get into more of that now. So Brett, talk to us about the Pacific Ocean sea surface temperatures and why are those relevant to the seasonal forecast?
Yeah, great question. And what we have here on the left, PDO and PMM acronyms for basically Pacific states, the state of the Pacific Ocean. The PDO is called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index. Normally, it's an index that kind of oscillates on a scale of 5, 10, even 20 years at times, from negative to positive. Right now, we're one of the strongest negative PDO states on record. And so that does have a pretty decent correlation as we work into the summer months, and starting to see a theme here. Once again, the core of the heat across parts of the southern and southwestern plains, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and into parts of Nebraska. Now, these years do tend to favor a little bit more of an active storm track and into the Mississippi Valley and the eastern ag belt. But once again, look where it's dry. Parts of the western plains, central plains, this one maybe a little bit further north into parts of the northern plains as well. We also need to factor in the PMM. This is important because this is kind of where our subtropical jet comes from. Normally what you get is you get a subtropical jet that comes through this area here, and it's really what helps fuel the plains with moisture if you're going to get it in the summer. However, when you have these colder than normal temperatures, sea surface temperatures off the southwestern coast of the United States, it makes it more difficult for that jet stream to pick up moisture. And specifically, it does tend to favor drier risk across the southern and southwestern plains when we have this negative PMM state. So this is something important that we need to watch. You think of years that were kind of La Niña going into summer in the past. Let's take 2018, for example. Big difference this year versus that year. That year we had quite a lot of moisture early in the season in parts of the plains and into the Midwest. That year was more of the warmer ocean waters off the southwestern coast of America. This year it's the opposite. So we don't have that moisture, that fuel of moisture that we had a couple of years ago in somewhat of a similar La Niña-like state.
Yeah, and kind of continue that conversation with the the severe weather talk, Brett. Let's talk about. I mean, it's been active recently, and there's a correlation to that you've shown here.
Yeah, for sure. And this was especially prevalent early in the spring, March and April, very active tornado months for much of the country, especially across parts of the deep south and the Mississippi Valley. I think March ended up with the most tornadoes on record. And you look at the Pacific Ocean, and it does have a pretty decent correlation to severe weather in the U.S. Not only tornadoes, this chart shows tornadoes, but wind and hail events as well. And what we're looking at here, you can see the blue line dropping off here near 2021. indicates that we're going into a steadier negative PDO state, one that we really haven't seen until or since the early 2010s, 2011, 2012, years that were pretty active with severe weather. So it's no surprise that we've started this year out pretty active with severe weather. And I think, as Michael mentioned earlier, this is a signal that as we work into the summer months, we may need to watch out for those MCSs or maybe even a derecho threat. That is not off the table, could increase the wind threat in parts of, especially maybe the northern plains, upper Midwest, as we work into the summer months.
Yep. It's great information. And I think, just something to consider that it's here recently too. We've had some big summertime severe weather events with some, if you think back to the derecho a couple of years ago that swept through Iowa, and it's not uncommon to get that. So it's always good to be prepared for that. Kirk, I know you've done a lot of research on just kind of drought, the index, the analogs, and you're always kind of constantly checking that. Tell us a little bit about the latest drought monitor and the indications, and maybe give us a hint too. What year really are we tracking closest to with current drought conditions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't think we show that year on here too. I think, Brett, what was it? 2013 was the closest, most recent analog. And the similarities to that year it's almost a bipolar, no moisture versus moisture. And you can see that on the drought monitor on the left here. You can see the oranges and the yellows and the reds are indicative of severe, extreme, or exceptional drought in a lot of those areas. And then just half a state, maybe even less than that to the east, there's nothing. There's plenty of moisture here. So we're really captivated by, almost two ends of the spectrum here. So a lot of times, we go back to the past and we see, hey, what were some similar years that did exactly to that? And the most recent year is 2013. It is popping up significantly in more ways than one here. But, and we're going to talk about here in a couple more slides that ongoing conditions. A lot of times the spring and summer pattern are a result of what happens from fall and into the winter time with moisture here. And, this is a good way too to kind of look at that. So years, the kind of transition of recent droughts that look similar or panned out similarly to what's going on right now since 2000, 2006, 2011, 13, and 14 here. So just looking for similarities, any kind of pattern recognition here. And it doesn't surprise me of, number one, the location on the left of where the core of that warmth is, as the previous analogs have showed that here. A lot of similarities to where we're the driest, we're the warmest here. And also not surprising that where we're a little bit cooler, northern plains into the Midwest, where we have been cool, especially in April and very wet, that's where a lot of those years, 06, 11, 13, and 14 were cooler and wetter. So we just look for things that have happened in the past, some pattern recognition to give us glimpses of, what's ahead. It's really hard to break a pattern like this in the southern United States, and a lot of those cotton areas where it's been so hot and so dry. You don't just get rid of that overnight or next week. And so we try to forecast how long out is that going to happen, and looking back in the past is a good way to gauge that for sure. But definitely noticing some similarities here.
Yeah, and I think that can help us with an indicator here in storm tracks. And Brett, you've looked a lot of this and tying storm tracks and preset patterns to the aridity index. Tell us a little bit about what is the aridity index and how is this working out?
Yeah, for sure. So this may be considered maybe a little bit more of an unorthodox way of looking at things, but I've done a lot of research over the past couple of months and looking back at some previous years, and even this spring, for example, we kind of use this idea for our spring outlook for precipitation. It's done pretty well. But the idea here of the aridity index, it's the combination of the standard deviation in precipitation and in high temperatures. So it really kind of combines the moisture you're getting with kind of the evaporation that you'd get during the daytime with those daytime highs. And ultimately what it can do is it's telling us areas where the storm track is more favored. And so let's look up to the north, for example, northern plains, North Dakota, Minnesota, into parts of South Dakota, Wisconsin. Those areas have been very cool and very wet, really struggling with high temperatures, really struggling with a lot of moisture in those areas so far this spring. The idea here is that cooler air and that moisture that's seeping into the ground, those soils, it tends to enhance the storm track in those areas. areas with the negative values, you can see the greens up to the north, it should tend to favor continued low pressure tracks and higher than normal moisture chances as we work into the summer months. On the flip side, let's look down in the southwestern United States, where it's been very hot. It's been very dry, really for a long time now, especially in these areas. That tends to reinforce the risk of high pressure developing as we work into the summer months. Recently, we've been noticing parts of the southeastern U.S. kind of have that feedback as well. You can see the yellows and browns in these areas, indicating a combination of less moisture, warmer high temperatures, which is going to favor one of two things. Number one, it's going to favor the risk that maybe the far southeastern ag belt, southeastern Indiana, Kentucky, parts of Ohio, could see more high pressure at times as we work into the summer months. But you get that southeastern ridge, you get that southeastern high, and it can favor the secondary storm track into parts of the eastern plains. And if we look here at past years, there's certainly support for this idea. You look at winter 2021 and into the spring of last year, look at where the moisture had set up, the cooler air and the moisture, southern and south central plains. It's exactly where the precipitation ended up verifying as we worked into last spring. We talked about 2018 earlier. Look at where the storm track was in spring of 18. It strongly hinted at the potential for northwest flow and high moisture as we worked in the summer months of 2018, and that is exactly what happened. You can see 2012, obviously one of the most notable ones. The stage was already set in the spring of 2012 for the drought and the heat that was to come in the following summer. And so it's just this idea of rolling that forward into the next season. We do that here. It favors those two storm tracks, one across the northern U.S., and then maybe a weaker but a secondary one, certainly possible across parts of the Mississippi Valley, Missouri, and maybe into parts of Illinois.
It surprises me how well this does too. And this is a good tool a lot of people don't know about when the weather models that they are so frequently these days are very inconsistent, especially beyond 1 week. You look for pattern recognition like this to help sift through the noise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. So we've covered quite a bit so far in terms of, the state of the Pacific Ocean and the ENSO evolution and kind of, some storm track indicators. And now I think it's important we want to talk about before we get right into the outlook, our official forecast, is we also need to look at recent summer climatology and what summers have recently done. This is just a look at the last 5 years and how they've verified and what the patterns have typically been like. But we were having a little discussion earlier that it is just not looking like this at all. So that's interesting because recent climatology is a big factor in seasonal outlooks. So Brett kind of touched a little bit on how does this make you feel? I mean, what do you think about this?
This is certainly a risk. You look at the month of April, and this April ended up very much like the last several Aprils have been, cooler and probably a little bit wetter overall. So this is a risk, in my opinion. I don't see a lot of analog support for this right now. Don't see a whole lot of trends right now through the month of May that we're going to end up with something like this. I think it'll be hard given how cool and wet the northern plains have been to be this warm, but it's got to be something you consider, and it's got to be something that at the very least you have in the back of your mind as a risk as we work through the summer months if something were to quote unquote go wrong versus what we're kind of thinking. And you look at the model data, not quite as far north as the past couple of years, but they are a little bit further north and west with some of the heat and some of the dryness than what some of the analog data would suggest. You can see that there on the European specifically. Core of the heat further north into South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, dryness more into the northern plains. That's a little bit closer to what we felt last year and really the last several years in general. So it is something to watch if something were to go wrong.
I will say, just transparency here. I feel like the Europeans been aggressive with dry and hot in the summer of the last few years.
Since 2018, at least.
Yeah, I feel like it kind of reverts to that. Boom, it's just dry and warm from the European model,
It's got to be climatology or something. Yeah.
So these are the analogs that our team has come up with. And what an analog is, for those of you that may not have a clue what an analog is, it's a year where the weather patterns, the global weather pattern drivers are similar to those of this year. So we can look for clues and hints as to how that may evolve going forward. The map on the left is a temperature from normal compilation of all these analogs combined. So with 2000, 2008, 2010. Looks like 2000 may be double weighted possibly or favored there. And then you have 11, 13, and 21. 2000 is definitely the top leading analog because of the third year Niña. But what this map tells us is the darker the colors go, the warmer, the more intense the warmth of the heat can be. And the same goes for the map on the right. This is precipitation. So the greens are where the wetter risks lie, and the reds and the maroon colors here are where the drier risks would set up based on our analogs, based on the research, taking all computer models and everything out. This is just an analog approach to that. So, guys, we've seen several maps that look like this here
Even the drought
show.
monitor. I mean,
Yeah.
even things like that.
Yeah, exactly. So this gives us, builds confidence, and it just kind of reassures us that, we're going somewhere with this. And so whenever we talk about analogs, we always like to look at our corn and soybean yield analogs. And we do really well with these. In fact, the last 4 or 5 years, we've done a very good job with our analogs and the yields. And this simply is what happens to the crop these years based on a weather perspective. And guys, on average here, our analog would suggest that we would be just below the trend line yield this year, about a bushel and a half below the trend line yield, based on kind of what we're looking at here. We have a couple of years that are trend line, and then we have 3 years that are below. The overall top analog, given the third year Niña, is that year 2000. And in the year 2000, it looks like we had right at a trend line yield, maybe just slightly above. But, we do have these years like 11 and 13 that were not great. And 10, these years were not super good years for corn yields. And even in the same sense here for soybeans. Kind of similar, the 2000 soybean crop wasn't as great. Most of our analogs suggesting that the soybean crop would also be below trend yield, with the most recent one last year being above. But there are certainly indications here in the weather forecast that it may not be as favorable. And it's already we're already seeing issues where our planting progress is the slowest it's been since 2013. Which happens to be our leading analog for our drought conditions. So this stuff, it works, it talks, and there is a legitimate risk here that we are not going to be looking at a record crop this year. That is a concern. I think it's something we need to continue to at least talk about. So going forward, Brett, tell us about these summer forecasts here, the kind of just a quick month by month breakdown. Tell me when you think when's it going to be the hottest and the driest period this summer, if you had to guess?
Yeah, Michael, and really, I think that the month of June, there's a little bit of a gradient. I think that there can at least be some moisture. Maybe you get stretches where it's drier, but I think that it's the month of July that we really need to look at. That can be a more widespread risk with heat, especially across the plains and into the desert Southwest where those drought conditions are. We certainly factor that in. But this overall setup for July, you just look at it, the gradient is just not as good. And I think that there's the risk that maybe the dryness could expand a little bit for the month of July. I think July is probably the hottest month. I think that it's probably the driest month, especially if you're in Iowa, Nebraska. I think that you're kind of right on the periphery of that ridge where your better storm tracks just a little bit further north into the east. You're still pretty hot. I think Iowa, Nebraska could have some concerns following a not so bad maybe June, where it's a little bit more active. That gradient's there a little bit more in June. And then August, maybe things start to moderate a little bit if you're in the Eastern Ag Belt, especially where it's not as active, where it was more active to start the summer, and a little bit cooler. I think overall, though, if you're in the Western Plains, it's going to be a pretty hot summer as a whole.
Yeah. I think this matters too, because, like we mentioned with those ENSO evolution analogs, it's no surprise that as we get into that July, what happened in those previous years, it kind of crept a little bit to the east. So that does matter kind of going forward. And it also matters the slow progress of planting, getting that seed into the ground here. That's why, July we know is the biggest month for pollination. The fact that we are slow to get that crop into the ground, it's an even more important month to make sure to get right. And, in terms of implications for the summer, July would be a big deal.
I would say too, Arlen has an interesting question. His question is both the 10 and 11 corn crop was due to, warm nighttime temperatures in July and August. And, I answered him, but I believe that could, if we can continue to increase subsoil moisture here, especially in the Central Plains, and the way the pattern looks to set up where there could be a core of the heat or a center of the ridge here in the Central Plains, that especially in the Central and Western Corn Belt, the elevated nighttime lows might be a risk this year. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, we saw that a lot in 2018 for the first half of the season before it really started to get wetter and cooler. But yeah, because of that core of that heat is centralized right over where the core of the corn is, that higher evapotranspiration as you get into those core of those months, it would not shock me at all. I think that is a really good point.
Yeah, and I'll note that even in parts of the eastern ag belt where it's been a little bit wetter so far this spring, we have warmer than normal. Much of Missouri, southern Illinois, Indiana, into parts of Ohio for a good portion of the summer. Combine some of the moisture we've had as we've worked throughout the spring with warmer than normal temperatures, that certainly would keep those nighttime lows up too, even into the eastern ag belt as well.
Yeah, and your aggregate reflects that really well in terms of the June, July, August departure. So the 90-day really overall forecast here. And note Northern Plains, note North Dakota, we still continue that pattern may be locked and loaded for a while. I know there's a lot of discussion and conversation about prevent plants going on up in the Northern Plains. I don't see anything that's going to change or derail that right now. I mean, the pattern is incredibly unfavorable for the folks in the Northern Plains, unfortunately, in the Southern Canadian prairies. Just a relentless parade of storms and cooler weather. This outlook overall, I could see this year already kind of seeing where there will be a tendency at times for there to probably be some significant spells of heat. I don't think it'll be persistent heat, but I think there can be, we get a big spike in the SOI and the angular momentum goes negative with the response in La Niña, and you're going to pop a big ridge in the central US. And then you're going to have thunderstorms go around the periphery of the ridge, and the outlooks reflect that idea perfectly. Brett, that's kind of what we're looking at the end of May into June. We may be looking at that setup already coming.
Yeah, for sure. And kind of what we've seen just over the past couple of days in the model data is, especially I would say in like this area here, there's been a warmer trend, and kind of on that aridity index, parts of Indiana, Ohio, and down further off to the south into the east have been getting a little bit drier, not persistently, but just enough that if maybe there's a warmer risk to the forecast, it would be across parts of the Ohio Valley and into the Tennessee Valley, and maybe you can get those bouts of heat. On the flip side, one note I want to make about the precip map here is if there's a risk specifically for June, because I think the core of the ridge and the heat probably sets up in July. If there's a risk for June, maybe more northwest flow in this area in the month of June. Could be some stronger to severe storm clusters more frequently if there's a risk in the month of June. We've seen that you get 2 or 3 storm clusters, and it can really drive how the summer ends up looking.
Yeah.
Well, in 2013, we had a couple of pretty significant clusters of storms too. There were a couple of derechos in 13 as well. So in terms of population weighted cooling degree days, and 995 on the total there, 995 last year. That is well above 5, 10, and 30-year normals. Brett, where would that rank us in all time? Do we have any idea? Did we look at that? Or it's got to be close to the top 5, right?
Yeah, I think it's 5th or 6th. That's right up there. I think it's right around 5th or 6th. I don't know exactly, but it's definitely up there. And I think here in a second, we have a slide that just shows the overall trend in cooling domain. We'll get to that here in a second.
Yeah, big deal with the natural gas prices the way they are as well.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Whenever you have a forecast like this for Texas, in the summer. That is going to be certainly a big deal. So let's talk about these forecast risks here quickly, and go over. We've mentioned it's a third-year Niña. It's rare, and it's the first time in 22 years. Dating back to 1950, as Brett had said earlier, only 4 of those loosely on record. And that may be a cooler risk. Tell us a little bit about these risks here to the forecast, Brett.
Sure. So the big one as far as precipitation is the IOD. That's basically the Indian Ocean dipole. It's the Indian Ocean temperatures and how they orient from west to east. And the big thing here is the model data right now is suggesting a negative IOD. We're not quite in there yet, but if we do indeed go into a negative IOD, it is a wetter risk overall for the summer months. Flip side, tropical forcing, just looking at some of the data right now, it's not surprising that the data is suggesting tropical forcing, and given what their forecast is, that it favors the warmth a little bit further off to the north. That'd be a little bit closer to how last year ended up if there's a risk to the forecast. But again, right now, not favoring that, just given how things have progressed so far this spring with the cool and wet northern plains and that storm track we're expecting.
Yeah, we've seen a rise in the IOD actually recently, pretty consistently too.
So James has a good question real quick. Do we have to watch out for troughs in the Alaskan Gulf that would potentially send rains over the top of the Midwest and allow for drier and hotter periods? I think what he's saying is basically, is that storm track going to continue to stay to the north? And I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, I would agree. That's typically where the jet stream's oriented.
Yep. Okay. So Brett, this is the slide you were talking about, the trend in those population cooling days, degree days. Tell us about that.
Yeah, just real quickly, it's just the trend really since records started being kept in 1952. And you can see years with 1,000 plus CDDs, there weren't any until 2010. We've had 4 in just the past 12 years. Same thing with 950 plus CDDs. Really, 950 is cool these days. 53 years until 2004, but pretty much every year since 2005 has had more than 950 CDDs. So it's just that overall trend. It's why it makes it very difficult to go anything lower than 990 for a summer forecast, just because that is where the trend has been heading, especially the past 20 or 30 years.
That's crazy. I mean, that's just
crazy.
Such an obvious trend that you just can't, you can't argue that. Yeah, you can't argue that. So with that being said, here's a look here as we get out of summer. This is a very early, very preliminary, just kind of 1,000-foot view on harvest, frost, and freeze analogs. What do we got here?
Yeah, so these are just basically the average of our analogs. The first frost and freeze date for some major cities. Really, there's nothing substantially early or late here. Most of them were around normal. I was kind of looking through each individual year, and there were maybe a couple in parts of, I believe it was, Peoria there, that were a little bit early. Peoria and into parts of maybe the plains that were a little bit drier can get those nighttime lows a little bit lower. But nothing that really stood out to me that was like, oh, really should be concerned about an early frost or freeze, or maybe it's going to be really, really late. They were all just kind of around normal, slightly later on average.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that if the La Nina conditions continue, that typically yields a warmer and drier harvest season anyways. And that's exactly what these analogs suggest. The area of high pressure and the ridge placement typically migrates even a little bit further north later into the summer and early fall, which would mitigate the risk of frost, which is crucial this year because of such late planting anyways. Any early frost or freeze would be completely detrimental to a lot of the crop. And it's nice to see that that's not a risk, at least as of right now. Perhaps it's a wetter risk in the eastern corn belt and soybean belt for harvest. But, that's kind of been the thing the last few years anyways. That's not really anything new. So at a 1,000-foot view, at a very early look, not any huge concerns in the harvest season. So last slide here is the hurricane season forecast. All right, let's Brett, give us an idea of the hurricane outlook, and I'm going to throw a quick poll up for you guys while that happens, and then Brett, take it away with the hurricane outlook.
Sure. Yeah. So this is the the last big note here for hurricane season and looking at some of those La Nina years, that can be a big driver of hurricane season because La Ninas typically lead to weaker winds in the Atlantic, which favors increased tropical cyclone development. However, we looked at some of our top years with what the Atlantic Ocean looks like right now with the multi-year La Ninas. It actually does favor a track that's a little bit more out to sea. It does favor an above normal season, but not quite like what, let's say, 2020 was when we were first going into the La Nina. The years that tended to stay La Nina for longer tended to favor above normal activity, but not quite as many as 2005 or 2020 or like that. So favoring above normal for storms, not substantially above normal. And actually several of our years here were actually below normal for total storms, but they still tend to favor several pretty intense storms. Does tend to favor the best track to be further off to the east. The one risk I'll note with this is the Gulf of Mexico is very warm right now. So if there's a risk to the forecast, it's that maybe this Caribbean secondary track here would try to find that fuel a little bit further off to the west. Analogs don't favor it, but it is at least a risk we need to watch as we get a little bit closer to hurricane season. The other thing I'll note with this, and maybe Kurt can talk a little bit more about it, is if this out to sea track verifies, would be a drier risk for the eastern ag belt because that tends to pull moisture away from the east coast. So really when these systems start developing, whether it ends up being July or August, will have a big impact on the eastern ag belt precipitation this summer.
Yeah, I completely agree. And a lot of people, they're like, well, why do you even talk about hurricanes? Well, it impacts so much more than just, where are those tropical systems going? A lot of times, you think about a hurricane, it has so much moisture. That moisture has to come from somewhere. And it pulls that from areas that are just north and to the west of those tracks. So a lot of times that's why we really try to nail down that track, because then you can nail down areas that the weather models may not see that will end up warmer and drier. So, and what's interesting too, we were just looking at it just before this presentation here. We're already kind of sniffing out some maybe early season tropical activity, low confidence yet, but sometime after the 20th of this month, the MJO is kind of passing through the area of the Caribbean. And, with how warm those waters are, it just wouldn't shock me to see some early season development. So we're getting to that time of the year.
Awesome, guys. So that's incredible information. Like I said, I did throw a poll up there. If you guys would be so kind to answer that for us, that would be great. Just gauging on kind of who is a customer and who isn't. And this kind of really concludes our outlook. We really appreciate the participation and everybody registering and logging in. So I am going to look at some questions here. If you guys have them, you can ask them. Okay. And while that's going, I do have one more question I would like to ask you guys. I thought I had it up here, but maybe not. I wanted to see what you guys thought about the webinar overall, but that's okay. It's not populating for me. So what kind of questions do we have? All right. What kind of questions do we have that I can answer for you guys before we wrap up? Let's see the chat Q&A. We look full here.
Here we go.
Let's see. Any questions, guys? Anything?
Looks like Aaron, thoughts on the Northern Plains drying out before June, Northeast North Dakota, Northwest Minnesota. Seems like rain week after week. If I had to answer that question, I would say I'm not, unfortunately, optimistic about those areas drying out, just based on the forecast ahead and just where the storm track is. The jet stream and everything seems to point exactly at that area, as much as we would hope that would happen.
Thank you, Eric. We appreciate that. Thank you, guys. Any other questions, guys, before we, will the trend in North Plains continue? We did that one. Joseph says, will Ohio Valley see wetter and strong storms this summer? Thank you for all your dedication. I think there's a wetter risk in the Ohio Valley, and there could be a strong storm or two.
Yeah, probably, clusters, storm clusters.
Yeah, I think we could see a couple of good MCSs maybe.
especially probably early in the season. I would think that gradient in June, probably dry periods and wet periods, maybe averaging out wetter early in the season, maybe not as much later in the season.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's see. Thank you, Aaron. We appreciate that. Another Aaron says, overall thoughts are to stronger storms for the Corn Belt resulting in wind and hail. I think, with the PDO, I think it's safe to say yes,
Yes.
that storms this year could be stronger with more wind and hail.
Yeah.
And even the attendant, the tornado threat. I mean, you can't rule that out with these MCSs, you know?
Especially with how strong the negative PDO is. I mean, you just jump right back to 2013, some of those 2012 years, and that is exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Pamela, for the comment. I appreciate that. And guys, thank you for answering the poll. Very, very great response there from that. Outlook for soybean yields based on weather conditions, Gabriella, we did indicate that a slightly below trend soybean yield is possible based on weather analogs and in our research. Steve says, what causes an omega block? Well, it's just the buckle in the winds, the jet stream pattern. It's the unique flow of the upper level winds that causes that to happen from time to time. And it's become more frequent in the last few years. And then, I think the term omega block has picked up some social media swag, if you will, just because it's a neat thing to say, but that's what causes it. Let's see here. Aaron says, thanks. Our customers still have time to purchase hail and wind products. Awesome. I would definitely encourage at least looking into that option, Aaron. Doug Gillum, very informative presentation. Thank you. We appreciate that, Doug. Hope you're doing well. He says, Southern Alberta is very dry. Do you think that trend continues, or do you see some hope for the start of the growing season? I think where they're located, I don't know. What do you think, Brett?
I think that there's some hope. There's kind of it really depends on where exactly the ridge sets up, because if it does end up a touch further north and west, like some of the data would suggest, it's a drier risk. But I think at the very least, you're going to have more chances as we work into summer. I think you're just close enough to that gradient around the ridge that there can be some chances. Would you all agree?
Yeah, I definitely agree. You just look
agree.
at how much precipitation's bottled up to the north in general versus the southwestern plains. It's got a higher potential.
Yep, for sure. Awesome. Check this out. Look at the results there. How about that? 40. Everybody said This was a great webinar. You guys are so kind.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, 100%er. That's what we call that.
Yeah, thank you guys. I appreciate that.
I'm new. Saw you, Kirk, on Bloomberg. Janice, thanks for attending. Gabriella, you are welcome. Thank you. Mika says, great information as always. Thank you, Mika. Appreciate that. Bill says, how is the Canadian model doing statistically compared to the other major models?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I don't have that answer right now in terms of how it's doing.
I would say looking at it consistently, significantly better than 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, it is a part of what we use pretty frequently. Surprisingly, it does really good on temperatures. It's handled the storm track most of this winter really well. A lot of its high resolution models are outperforming the American models a lot of times. So they've made some huge strides.
Yeah, it's actually quite a bit warmer than the EPS and the GEFS later in week 2, which we kind of factored into our forecast today. I think that there's some merit to that to close out May, that it could get hotter, and the Canadians trying to pick up on it first. I'll be very interested to see how that verifies.
Yep, for sure. Let's see. Thanks for the presentation. Sorry, I'm not able to get on and start. Got late. Any explanation or reasons to how the weather 3 weeks ago, pretty much all forecasters were not seeing what we are currently in now? Thank you. Whoever wrote that, KF Farms, I mean, I'll tell you that was certainly not the case with our forecasts. We have been talking about this for going on 6 or 7 weeks. I mean, plant delays, and we've even told customers multiple times we thought that May 10th and beyond was when things are going to start rolling, and that was when the safe time to start planting is. It's May 11th. It's really spot on. I can't speak to what other people are saying as to why, but I know that, a lot of other vendors and forecast providers copy and paste weather model data, and they don't really look much further into it than that. And there's not a lot of, it's really, hey, here's what the GFS says, here's what the CFS says, and then there's not a lot of analysis or thought or care if it's right or wrong. So I don't know if that answers your question. You know, our forecasts here have been way ahead of the entire pattern, in my opinion. So thank you, Phil. Appreciate that. Let's see here. What is the hot temp risk in California considering Southwest temp outlook? What are the odds of the drought getting better in 2023? Well,
Depends on a lot on ENSO.
Yeah, exactly. It does. And I personally don't see it improving anytime soon. Maybe if we can flip the script here and warm up the PMM and the ENSO, you know, maybe we can turn into an El Nino and fire hose a jet into the Southwest US, but that's
certainly not a next week kind of a deal.
Yep. Gail says, is Southern Nebraska doomed? In summary, is Central and Nebraska and Northern Kansas doomed to suffer from an extreme drought? I'll let you answer that, Brett.
Well, much of Nebraska is already in severe drought conditions, and with the summer forecast, whether it's record-breaking or anything like that, there's no way to know. But the forecast is hotter and drier this summer, so it begs to reason that it's probably the drought conditions are probably going to continue and probably even get worse as we work into the summer months. For Nebraska, your best chance is June with that northwest flow. Beyond, if you don't cash in June, I think that you're really going to be looking at some really, really bad issues.
Yeah. Ryan, your question's pretty specific. You know, I don't really know that I can, you know, give you any type of good answer to that in terms of where the dry line's going to set up and EMLs and that kind of thing. There's just no way in a seasonal forecast that I could really divulge, you know, or would give you an accurate answer to that. Just it would change tomorrow. So, so I apologize, but I don't really have an answer for that. How long will the drought in Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma last? I mean, for the foreseeable future, you know,
say at least through August.
Yeah.
Minimum.
Yeah, for the foreseeable future, for sure. So guys, one more minute and I'm going to wrap it up here on questions. Any last minute questions before we end the presentation here? If you're not a customer, all right, and you're considering $695 a year, this ends at the end of this month, the end of May, June 1st, this deal goes away. But if you want a way to stay caught up and up to date with literally everything you could imagine weather-wise, this is where to get it. This is where to get the information. You can contact us, sign up. You can go to bamwx.com or weatherportal.com and literally select this option and sign up and try it out. It's normally $810. June 1st, it goes back to $810. All right. It's highly underpriced for the amount of value you get. It's crazy. So, you know, confidence on the summer forecast on a scale of 1 to 10. I don't know. I'd give it a 7. I'm pretty confident.
Yeah. 6.5, 7.
Yeah.
With the 3-year La Nina, maybe slightly less, you know, with the uncertainty there, but 6.5, 7 is pretty solid.
Well, guys, this will conclude our summer forecast. This recording of this will be sent to you. We appreciate all the kind words and the feedback and the participation. And you guys have a great rest of your day. We'll talk to you soon.
See you guys.